Hi everyone. Welcome to an exclusive Asia briefing vlog. My name is 𝐸𝐫𝐤 and I'll be your host through this clip. Throughout 2022, we'll feature our partner and parent company, Dezan Shira & Associates, as they celebrate their 30th anniversary this year. Each month we'll speak to a partner, expert, or guest as they discuss the firm's history to present-day story and on-the-ground issues that businesses face in today's thriving and rapidly developing Asia. To kick us off, I'm joined today by the firm's founder, Mr. Chris Devonshire-Ellis. Chris founded Dezan Shira & Associates 30 years ago in Shenzhen, China. Since then, people have come to know the firm for its thought leadership, Asia briefing publications, and Pan-Asia business market entry, corporate, and technical advisory services. Welcome, Chris. Happy anniversary, and congratulations on the firm's success these last 30 years.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Good to be here, and thanks for your best wishes. I'm in my house in Sri Lanka, where I've been for most of COVID lockdown, working from home, and as you can see, it's warm but pleasant. So yeah, from Sri Lanka.
Fantastic. So if we jump into our first question here, what inspired you to set up Dezan Shira 30 years ago?
Well, I'd been to mainland China a few times, Shanghai and Beijing, around about the just shortly after, before and after Tiananmen, actually, the Tiananmen incident, and it seemed to me to be obvious that the country was going to open up. At the time, I was working for a legal Asia law and practice in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong, the handover to China was still in the future, but there was this kind of feeling that of uncertainty. Nobody knew what was going to happen. But I had a different view. I could, through my travels to China in those days, there was a different sense, and particularly in Shenzhen. Shenzhen was a special economic zone. It was very vibrant. Everybody from China wanted to go there. And it was just very vibrant, very open, a can-do kind of attitude as this country, huge country, was opening up. And Deng Xiaoping said that to get rich is glorious. And I thought that that was a key phrase that China would open up. But I do remember discussing this with my boss at the time. And he said, "Chris, don't go to China. It's dirty, nothing works, horrible, they're communist, and they'll rip you off." And you know what? All of those things were true, but none of them to a fatal degree. So I went. I just saw the opportunity, and despite people saying you shouldn't go, longer term, I think it's been proven I made the right decision.
So amidst all of that, how did you get the company started? Why Shenzhen, and who was your first client?
Well, Shenzhen was important. It was China's first special economic zone. The entire city and the region around it, there was a border you had to cross in to get into or out of Shenzhen. So it was this was because first of all, it was only a relatively small place in those days, and it had different taxes and different laws. And Shenzhen, the profits tax was just 15%, and in Shekou, which is a special economic zone within a special economic zone, where all the oil gas companies were starting operations, drilling in the South China Sea, the rate was even lower. It was down to 7%. So I thought that those tax incentives would motivate foreign investors to go to China. Again, most people going to China at that time, foreign executives, they would head for Shanghai or Beijing. But I felt that the Shenzhen's attractiveness through its tax perspective would see that a lot of manufacturers would go there. And again, that was the right call. In terms of our first client, the first piece of business that Dezan Shira ever did was a trademark for a pub. It was an expatriate pub called the Red Roosters, which I and everybody else used to go and drink in. And the owner there, a chap called Tom Nordell, asked me if I'd do his trademark for him. And so I did. I registered his trademark. And there's a lesson there. Because this was a pub, it was a centre of expatriate life in those days. So people would say to Tom, you know, how did Chris, how did he work out with your trademark and his company? And he said, oh, they did a great job. So the Red Rooster pub became a strategic client because Tom told everybody that I could do the work, and then I started getting in other clients as a result of that. So getting strategic clients is an important message. It doesn't really matter who they are, and in our case it was a pub, but yeah, fittingly a pub was our first client.
So flash forward, you've now been the legally responsible person for Dezan Shira now for 30 years, and that has got to be close to a record for a foreigner in China. How did that come about?
Well, the term legally responsible person, yeah, 30 years, I must be one of the oldest, but the term has changed. When I set up Dezan Shira and Associates in 1992, there wasn't a legal industry in China. There were no lawyers, but there were legally responsible people, and to do that, you had to get an exam. You had to pass an exam. So I spent many evenings, days and evenings in the library in a public library in Hong Kong, reading up on mainland Chinese law to enable me to sit this exam, which I sat in Guangzhou actually, to be a legally responsible person. It was quite a big deal in those days. It was the same as being a lawyer. China then liberalized the legal industry in 1994, and that had an interesting episode to it, because all of the erstwhile legally responsible people that were working in government all suddenly left to set up their own law firms. That noise you can hear there, that's monkeys in the garden. So yeah, one of the first legally responsible person. I passed the exam and set up Dezan Shira and Associates representative office. In those days, representative offices could only be in hotels. So our first rep office was in an hotel in Shenzhen, and that's how we started. And I've had my legal responsible person license on our business certificate issued for 30 consecutive years after that. So I guess I must have proven to the Chinese government I'm doing a good job.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is what was the business and operational landscape like at that time?
Wow. Well, it was it was very different. As I mentioned earlier, in 1992. The handover of Hong Kong to mainland China was still 5 years away, and Hong Kong was really in full-on last party on earth mode. Places like Joe Bananas, the China Jump, and 97, and various other clubs that people will remember from that time. It was real full-on party mode, but it was a party with an end to it, because Hong Kong was being handed back, and nobody quite knew exactly what would happen. In Shenzhen, it was the reverse. It was a special economic zone, and everyone in China wanted to be there because it was close to Hong Kong, and there was this feeling that China was going to open up, it was going to develop. So the ambience was totally different. You went from the slightly psychotic party mode of Hong Kong, and it's going to all go back, to the real upbeat mood in mainland China, particularly in Shenzhen at that time, where everything's going to open up, it's going to be great. So the atmosphere in the mainland China was actually more positive leading up to 1997 than it was in Hong Kong. But the vibe was totally different. The Soviet Union had recently ceased to exist, so there were loads of Russians that were running away from the Soviet Union. There were a lot of Russians there. There are also a lot of Chinese, and you had to have special permission to come into the special economic zone. The government, they wanted certain people to come in there, not everybody. But people from all over China came to Shenzhen. They had all different dialects, so they couldn't always understand each other. So they would write the character in the air with their hands, something that you don't see nowadays. There are also fabulous Chinese restaurants in Shenzhen, where our first office was, because Sichuan and Hebei and Henan and Heilongjiang all have different cuisines. So all these amazing restaurants. One of the stranger things at the time was that some Chinese entrepreneur bought a Soviet aircraft carrier and parked it in the Shenzhen River. It was called it was a Soviet aircraft carrier. It was called the Minsk, and there were ideas to turn it into a nightclub. And this thing just sat there, massive, in the Shenzhen River, on the border between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. Huge Russian Soviet-era aircraft carrier. So bizarre times, but a lot of fun, a lot of energy, and that really laid the groundwork, I think, in Shenzhen. Not Shanghai. It was Shenzhen that laid the groundwork for the development of contemporary China.
It must have been a huge club, very interesting times. I know what you mean about the character writing. It was still here about 10 years later, but you're right, you don't see that anymore. So from a business perspective, what were the main challenges for the firm and having it move forward throughout some of those early years?
Well, there were two challenges. First of all, what were we going to do? And with a legal background, the obvious thing is we're going to provide legal services. But you don't have to hire a lawyer. And our early cash flow was very erratic. It was going up and down. We'd do some business one month, and we wouldn't get any clients for a couple of months, and then we get another client. It was very erratic, and I felt that we needed to have better cash flow. So I hired a young girl, Virginia Liu, who was actually 9 months away from going to study in Canada. But Virginia had worked for Ernst & Young, and she was a friend of my then girlfriend. So Virginia came to work for us for a short period of time, Dezan Shira, and we started providing accounting services, and that meant we generated cash flow. We had some fairly major clients, Devon Energy, who are one of the big oil companies out of Texas. They were an early client, and so we mixed up legal services, which could be a bit erratic. Not everyone wants to set up a woofie every day, but they have to do their tax every month. So we had good cash flow. Solving the cash flow issue of how we're going to get sustainable revenues into the company was a challenge. The second challenge was how do we get people to know about us, because we didn't have a lot of money, and you know, money was tight. But I then hit on the idea of making a magazine, which we called China Briefing. I printed off 500 copies from a hotel photocopier, and I think the first issue was how to set up a representative office in China. 500 copies, and I took them to the business centers of all the 5-star hotels in Shenzhen and Guangzhou, which is where the foreigners would be staying. There weren't many in those days, perhaps about, between the two cities, perhaps about 30 or 40 hotels, and put this in the business center. And then my phone started to ring. We saw, we want to do this, we want to do that. So that worked. The next month I did the second issue of China Briefing, which was about individual income tax, because I know that expats are always concerned about their taxes in China and wanting to pay as little of it as possible. So I thought that would be a good topic. Printed off 1,000 copies, and I took the train to Shanghai and Beijing and distributed it amongst the 5-star hotels there. And then we started getting calls from customers in Beijing and Shanghai. And on the back of that, I immediately opened up two offices in serviced offices. So from nowhere, by 1992, starting off with a little hotel room in Shenzhen, by 1994, we had offices in Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing. With the success of China Briefing, I made little stickers because they were cheap, and I used to put them in backs of taxis and in all sorts. So within a year, Dezan Shira went from just being a little firm in Shenzhen to being a nationally known business because of its guerrilla marketing, putting these stickers everywhere. China Briefing, there was a website, and that was how we solved it. So I think in another way, when you don't have any money, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you've got to, if you're working on a tight budget, you've got to be prepared to do what your competitors aren't doing. And you've got to, having no money makes you think a little bit more about how to solve problems. And I think that sometimes that's an advantage. if we'd had plenty of money, we'd have blown it on advertising and not had anything tangible as a result. But now we have China Briefing, which, as you know, has now morphed into Asia Briefing and has millions of readers and publications all over Asia. So yeah, getting our name out there, guerrilla marketing, you know, and thinking about problems instead of just chucking money at them is a good way to go.
Absolutely. Well, it's amazing how far the firm has come from that point, certainly, and I think we'll be touching on this point throughout the year with this series as the firm celebrates its 30th anniversary. But maybe before we wrap up, it's Chinese New Year shortly. Do you have any messages that you might want to share with the viewers?
Yeah, to all our friends and colleagues and other people that we've known in mainland China, 新年好, in Hong Kong and Guangdong, 恭喜发财. So Happy New Year, good blessings, prosperity, and have a good time. We're getting over COVID now, hopefully, and there'll be some resemblance of life back to normal. So God bless, and have a great 2022, Year of a Tiger.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's such a pleasure to speak with you, and really appreciate your taking the time to tell us about the roots. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That was a delightful interview with Chris Devonshire-Ellis. Now, before we wrap up for today, we have some friends of the firms that have been kind enough to send in some clips, and we'd like to share those with you now.
Well, thank you. And again, I came to China in 2001, been in Asia since 1987. And every hotel that I went to had one thing in common, and that was they had a pamphlet, a brochure from Dezan Shira. And it was always very interesting, and I would read it. And so I decided I'm going to call this gentleman. So as we looked at opportunities here, I found something instantly with your company. You've got a great company, a great future. I work with Sabrina, of course, here in Beijing, who's a tremendous asset for your company. Chris and I have known each other since 2001. But it goes well beyond providing accounting, financial, legal, advisory services. This is very personal in nature. Chris and his whole team not only view the company and the success of the company is very important to them, but personally, they're there for you 24/7. Any company that would work with you, I think, can look well beyond the veil of what normally is provided and the opportunities that are there. And I've never hesitated for a moment in highly recommending your company and that people work with your firm. I want to wish you, I want to wish Chris, Sabrina, and the whole team another 30 years and tremendous success in the Year of the Tiger at 𝐸 It's been truly a pleasure.
Since my arrival in China in 2001, Dezan Shira's experts, thought leadership and publications have helped to guide my understanding of the opportunities, risks and approaches doing business in China and Asia for more than 20 years.
I met Chris Devonshire-Ellis in a lift. We started talking. And when I realized the type of services which his company offered, I became interested because it was clear, even in my early days in China, that some serious reorganization of the company was required. Helped me to formulate an idea of where things had gone wrong with the joint venture. We realized that we would have to disentangle ourselves from several relationships. At that stage, the relationship with Dezan Shira was more consulting and working out whether we would go in this direction or that direction. And so that was, again, very helpful with not only with Chris, but obviously Alberto and several other people were involved in discussing the future. It was one of the larger projects that Dezan Shira had been involved with up to that stage. And we ended up with a much reduced number of offices, but in locations and set up in ways in which they were actually beneficial to my company.
We're certainly grateful to our friends Ray Kelly of ACSI Financial Services in Beijing, Paul Mackler of PMLA Asia Sourcing out of New York, and Simon Lazenbat, former director from the pharmaceutical sectors with Grunenthal PLC of Germany. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for next month. We'll have another interview coming up. We'll hold the details until then. Thanks very much. Bye for now.